Good evening, attendees of this fourth Reset webinar with the distinguished Professor Ross Garnaut. Welcome back to those of you who have attended previous lectures, and welcome to those of you who are attending for the first time. I am Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Please also join me in extending a special welcome to our Deans and Deputy Deans, our Business and Economics Board members, Alumni Council members, and Young Alumni Committee members. Previously, we have covered topics such as the foundations for Australia's current economic position. Ross explained why he believes a return to dog days is not possible. Last week, Ross focused on what is needed to restore prosperity. His presentation focused on post-pandemic macroeconomic policy for full employment, which included key drivers such as trade, ensuring our competitiveness, and other measures needed to drive economic growth. Equally important is the role of equity as a precondition for growth. Ross has presented many pieces of the puzzle to understand how we recover economically. Last week, he mentioned the role of rent, and I'm looking forward to learning more about what he means by rent. For those of you who are new to this lecture series, Professor Ross Garnaut is highly regarded in Australia for the roles he has played to influence economic policy and international relations. Ross's long-standing career has encompassed a range of positions that have included policy advisor, diplomat, and businessman. It is with much delight that Ross is my colleague at the Melbourne Institute. While these lectures were initiated as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, over the last couple of weeks we have seen another crisis emerge in the US, with the haunting killing of George Floyd by a police officer. Around the world, this has sparked commentary and outcries for ending racism and inequality. Sadly, 2020 has become an unprecedented year on many fronts. The importance of thoughtful discourse by leaders like Ross is even more important with all that is happening around the world. Please welcome Ross Garnaut.
Thank you, Abigail. And yes, this is becoming a full and difficult year and a pivotal year in which it's important that people like us put the effort into thinking through the issues and finding the best way forward for our country in the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about cricket this evening. Just before everything closed, my wife Jane and I went along to the MCG and were two of 95,000 people watching Australia defeat India in a splendid women's game, the final of the Women's Cup. The other great sport of Melbourne and Southern Australia, Australian football is now also a women's game, but all of those fine athletes who were geared up for a season played a couple of games and then their season stopped. They were amongst the many victims of the pandemic crisis, and a lot of the victims of this crisis are younger people, especially women, and one of the policy reforms I'm going to talk about today will be especially helpful for young people, for those not yet in secure places in the labour force, and especially women and second earners in households. I said in the first lecture in this series that our economic challenge is of historic dimension. We have entered the deepest domestic and global recession since the Great Depression. The decline in global trade since the beginning of the year has been larger than in the first year of the global financial crisis or the Great Depression. For Australia, the pandemic recession follows the dog days. For Australia, The pandemic recession follows 7 years of stagnant wages and incomes of ordinary people, high underemployment, and lower growth in per capita output and incomes than in other developed countries, including Japan. Lecture 3 discussed the way through to full employment by 2023 and broadly based rising incomes after that. There is a way to achieve that while we gradually reduce public debt as a share of the economy after 2023 in preparation for the next big economic shock, because there will be another one. But to find and to follow that way will require economic understanding and policy leadership of historic dimension. There have been 4 developments that warrant attention since the last lecture in the series a week ago. First, Prime Minister Morrison said that the government wants to shift the focus of fiscal policy from payments to keep people going through loss of jobs to increasing the numbers of people with jobs. He is right to want to do that. The focus on income support was necessary as large parts of economic activity were restricted to deal with the disease. That is not sustainable indefinitely. Large budget deficits have to be maintained for a number of years. First, to stop demand falling off a cliff when current income support is scheduled to end in September, and then to achieve full employment on the earliest possible timetable. And after that, to achieve rising living standards. As I said last week, after an historically unprecedented budget deficit this year, the Commonwealth deficit will need to be about twice as high in 2021, with its composition shifting to support activities that increase future incomes, as well as current demand, incomes and employment. The second development in the last week is that the foreign exchange value of the Australian dollar has continued to rise. Chart 4.1 updates the data presented last week. We've now, if you look at the heavier grey line above 2020, before that, there's developments in the exchange rate against the SDR, that's an average of currencies, comparing movements in the Australian dollar, the blue line, with Brazil, Indonesia, and the United States through the period from the early 90s to 2020. We moved broadly in line with the United States, experienced a very big appreciation, increase in value of our dollar against Brazil and Indonesia. I've included Brazil and Indonesia because they're our biggest competitors for our 2 largest exports, Brazil for iron ore and Indonesia for coal. And then from 2020, I've shown the movements through this year. Not much to begin with in the first month or 2. And then we experienced a significant depreciation. A weakening dollar is a higher level. The blue line goes up, and we lost ground in competitiveness against Brazil, but gained it against Indonesia and the US dollar and the SDR, the average of other currencies. But recently, the last month or 2, we've been losing that ground with the appreciation of the Australian dollar. We've now retraced most of the gains in competitiveness from dollar depreciation that emerged from the announcement of a new approach to monetary policy in March. This is a big setback to early and strong recovery. It underlines the caution I expressed last week against monetary policy being tighter than in the rest of the developed world. The third development is another downward step in the Sino-Australian relationship, with the Chinese government's warning about travel to Australia. This is looking more and more like a major downward shift in Australian international opportunity. It will not make it impossible to achieve full employment, but it will lower the standard of living of Australians that is consistent with sustainable full employment. We'll discuss the international context of the restoration of Australia in the final lecture. The fourth development is the Parliamentary Budget Office's release of estimates of future budget deficits. These estimates suggest a range out to 2930, summing over the decade from a lowest case of $500 billion to $100+ billion more than that. In the absence of the usual Treasury budget forecasts and projections, it's the first official public sector estimate of the effects of the pandemic on the budget. The Budget Office projections are not far from my rough estimates in last week's lecture. I said in Lecture 3 that policy directed to early full employment would see deficits of perhaps about 90 billion this financial year, and that we need to see 180 billion next, and $500 billion in the years 2 and including 22-23. Necessary, that is, if we wanted to move promptly back to full employment. My headline number for accumulated deficits of $500 billion is coincidentally the same as the Parliamentary Budget Office. The difference is my focus on supporting demand with large enough Commonwealth deficits in the early years to move quickly to full employment by 2023. The next chart recalls and extends a chart from Lecture 2 on Australia's economic performance. Those of you who were with us in the second lecture will recall the first 3 parts covering the period from the early 90s until the end of 2019. The blue lines represent Australia. In the top third of the chart, we've got population growth. In the middle third, GDP growth, output growth per person, and the bottom, total GDP growth, which is the product of more population growth and GDP per capita. If you just look at GDP growth per person, Australia was very high by international standards in all 3 periods. I've divided those 20 years, 30 years, 28 or 9 years of unbroken economic growth in Australia into 3 periods. The first, up to early in this century, I called the productivity boom. Here we had population growth just over 1 percentage point. We had GDP per capita growth of around 3% per annum, and total GDP growth at about 4%. This was on all of those numbers well in advance of other developed countries, and I've included comparisons. The orange line is that all OECD countries together, and the red, our neighbour in the Western Pacific, Japan. Australia well ahead of the OECD and even further ahead of Japan on each of the measures. The next period, from the beginning of the century to about 2012, I've called the resources boom, and you'll recall that during that period, Australia again was superior to the OECD as a whole and Japan in all the measures of growth. Productivity growth wasn't as strong. GDP per person was not as strong as it had been in the 90s, but still high by world standards. So GDP per capita was a good deal higher than the OECD and much higher than Japan. Total GDP growth in Australia much stronger than other developed countries or Japan. Then the last 7 years, from early 2013 to the end of last year, period I call the dog days, Australia still had higher total output, GDP growth, than the developed country average or than Japan. But in this later period, the superiority came entirely from population growth. We had much faster population growth than other developed countries and faster than in the productivity boom or the resources boom. But output per person was lower than the OECD average and lower than Japan, a country that Australians have tended to think of as a poor economic performer. That's why, as Abigail mentioned in the introduction, I don't think that we should aspire to going back after this pandemic recession to what we had in place before the recession, before the pandemic, because that was not very good. In the right-hand side, to the right of the black line, I've introduced 2 other periods. One, 2020-23, a 4-year period It's a period in which, with good policy, I see us achieving full employment. I don't think we had full employment during the dog days. We haven't had full employment for a long time. And I've included two cases for Australia. A blue case. Here we've only got Australia. I'm not comparing us with other countries for the period of achievement of full employment. The blue is what I think we could achieve with sound policy. Not beyond reach, well within reach. I think we'd get there with the sorts of approach that I'm suggesting in these lectures. The green is where I think we'd be if we simply set out to put back in place, to snap back to where we were when the pandemic hit. In the period to 23, the period of achievement of full employment, simply snapping back to the pre-recession levels will leave us with very little GDP growth, probably with a small decline in per capita GDP growth, and a lower but positive population growth. On the other hand, good policy will leave us with slightly higher population growth as the automatic flows from New Zealand and family members is a bit higher. But I think it's reasonable to aspire to productivity growth, not as high as in the productivity boom. We can't repeat that extraordinary period because we've already won a lot of the low-hanging fruit, but there are many things that we could do to perform better. And we'd end up with GDP growth not spectacularly high by the period, by the standards of the long boom, the 3 decades of unbroken economic growth, but a bit better than the dog days, and output per person significantly better than during the dog days. And the bigger difference between simply returning to what we had before and having an ambitious reform program to raise economic performance can be seen on the right-hand side of the chart. Again, the green is snapping back to what we had in place, the approach to policy we had in place before the pandemic, and the blue is actively pursuing reform. And the big difference there is the opportunity that comes from higher productivity growth. And it is realistic, I think, to see GDP growth returning to a bit below what it was during the productivity boom, and higher than during the resources boom and the dog days. So that's a broad framework, and in the book that comes out of these lectures, I'll be spelling that out in more detail. I said in the first lecture that to get us to that blue line in the right-hand columns of the chart, we're going to need a policy of historic quality, economic policy of historic quality to deal with the recession of historic dimension. This is hard, but when you think about it, all of the alternatives are in the end much harder. Ordinary Australians have just endured 7 years of incomes restraint, tighter than anything known since modern Australia emerged from the gold rushes of the 1850s, with the singular exception of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, after the sudden dislocation of the pandemic, they must be asked to endure restraint in the public interest extending many years into the future. Past experience tells us that there are conditions on which Australians will be prepared to give their democratic assent to this restraint. There are conditions under which our democratic polity will assent to continuing change in the public interest in the structure of the economy and the organisation of work. Experience from the Great Depression, the Reconstruction after World War II, and the reform era from 1983 to 2000 tells us that our good conservative democracy can accept such restraint. but if and only if two conditions are met. The first condition is that there is widespread understanding and acceptance that there are good reasons for the change. The second condition is that the benefits of change are being shared equitably. Confidence in early full employment and equitable distribution are preconditions for making post-pandemic restoration rather than post-pandemic dog days the path that we follow after the great crash of 2020. Most policy change is incremental. Most policy change grafts small adjustments onto a complex body of policy, law and regulation. Complexity grows over time, and many current actors in the policy process lose or never gain a sense of why each part is there. Each policy increment trips over others and reveals a new problem requiring another adjustment. In good periods for policy, the small changes make things better in a small way. In bad periods, the corrections introduce more stumbling blocks than they remove, leading towards the stagnation to which Nobel Prize-winning economist Manson Olson drew attention. The depth of the pandemic recession and the extent of economic stagnation that preceded it give us unusual reason and opportunity to think about and to implement fundamental changes in the framework of economic policy. Some of the most important possible reforms would cost the budget a great deal of money before they bring transformationally large economic and fiscal benefits. Now, when it is prudent to run large fiscal deficits simply to hold up demand and economic activity, is a good time to consider such reform. Now, when a great deal of normal economic life has been disturbed by pandemic and recession, may be a good time to enact change that introduces disturbance. Once confidence in full employment and equitable distribution have been broadly established, a reform program can embrace 100 productivity-raising changes that were never possible before. In discussing the reform task before us in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I used to talk about how a century always comprised plenty of singles, as well as a few big sixes over the fence. As the governor of the Reserve Bank has said on a few occasions, many opportunities for singles are contained in reports by many institutions and commentators. My own favourite singles at the moment include conversion of state land transaction stamp duties to annual taxes on land value. They include road congestion taxes to replace other charges on motorists. They include reform of our federal fiscal arrangements to remove overlapping responsibilities and diffuse responsibilities between the Commonwealth and the states. That last one, federal fiscal reform, is a four, not a single. I do not downplay the importance of the singles. They are essential contributions to a century. But there are a couple of sixes waiting to be hit over the fence that would establish a sound foundation for full employment and equitable distribution. They would break up the field for a lot of singles. First is replacing the corporate income tax by a tax on rent. The Business Council has never given up on a cut in the corporate income tax. An extension of the 25% corporate tax rate for small business to big business, as favoured by the Business Council and the big end of town, would have some positive effects on investment and output. The careful independent analysis, for example, by Dixon and others at the Centre for Policy Studies, shows that this positive effect on output will be small. So small that it will be outweighed in its effect on national income by the transfer of tax revenue to foreign owners of businesses benefiting from the tax cut. National income would fall. A substantial part of business income is economic rent. Some is the normal return on investment in businesses operating in a competitive environment. A cut in the corporate income tax rate does not encourage investment in economic activity to the extent that it falls on rent. Small businesses are more likely to operate in a competitive environment. This provides a rationale for the current practice of taxing small businesses at a lower rate than big businesses. If we find a more efficient way of reducing the tax burden on businesses operating in a competitive environment and increasing taxation on rent, we remove the rationale for the differential rate of tax favouring small business. Rent, unlike the income from competitive investment, can in principle be taxed without reducing national output or income. The reconciliation of principle and practice requires an efficient form of rent taxation. I'd like to put up a slide now drawing attention to a couple of very important comments about the role of rent. The first, it's included in a private letter from Bob Solow, Nobel Prize winner, for developing the framework for analysing productivity growth and dividing growth into growth in the capital stock, growth in labour, and growth in productivity. All of the work that all of us have done on measuring total factor productivity growth and on the distribution of income between capital and labour over the last half century has been based on his work. Well, Bob Solow wrote to Max Corton in November 2017 saying, "We conventionally allocate all of the value added to either compensation of labour or return to capital, debt and equity. That would be fine if there were perfect competition. In reality, there is a third component, monopoly rent. It gets allocated to labour and capital in unknown proportions. What one would like is a three-way breakdown in market return to labour, market return to capital and rent." There's the author of the approach to analysis that's endlessly repeated by modelers working for business organisations in showing the gains that we would get from a cut in corporate income tax, saying we actually have to take something else into account. And thanks, Max, our esteemed colleague, Max Corton, for agreeing for me to use this quote. And then in last year's address, presidential address to the American Economic Association, Olivier Blanchard said that he spent a lot of time analysing some of the big changes in the world economy and the phenomenon that's come to be discussed as secular stagnation, noting that we can't understand what is going on in the world economy unless we attribute a big role to an increasing role for rent. That's an article that's either just or is soon to come out in the American Economic Review. Well, what is rent? Rent is income of a factor or of an input into production which earns a return in excess of that necessary to attract it to the activity in which it is engaged. It persists because supply from the activity cannot expand. A number of reasons why it might not be able to expand as a result of investment. Might be because the rent is earned by a specific resource or input which is more valuable, more productive than alternatives, and it cannot be reproduced by investment, perhaps because it's a natural resource, superior urban or agricultural land or mineral deposits. A superior mineral deposit earns rent. Or could be that rent exists and persists because regulation blocks entry of newcomers. And this is important in banking, in patents, controls on location of chemist shops, taxi licenses, and many other areas regulated by governments. Or rents might persist because one or a small group of investors find a way of blocking newcomers. Or it might persist because there are natural monopolies, industries in which overwhelming economies of scale relative to the size of a market stop newcomers from becoming competitive. Classic examples are railway lines or transmission and distribution lines for electricity or pipelines for gas. It would not actually be efficient for society to have 4 or 5 transmission lines from competing suppliers of electricity running down your street. When we're analysing rent, we have to be very clear on a distinction between what Alfred Marshall 150 years ago drew between rent and quasi-rent. We have to be careful that when we're seeking to tax a rent, we don't accidentally tax a quasi-rent. A quasi-rent is something that an investment for which the return is in excess of what is necessary to hold a factor in its current use, but it's temporary because its continuation depends on continuing investment. And as Marshall told us, tax a quasi-rent and you reduce future income and output. Not all rents are bad. Some emerge in an efficient economy. Some need to be nurtured by government in an efficient economy. But when they exist, they must be taxed or regulated to secure the public interest. Rents in land or mineral resources would not exist if governments did not regulate access to them. If you had a free-for-all in access to Pilbara iron ore, there'd be no rents to producers. You'd get more and more miners coming in until average incomes fell to levels necessary to attract labour and capital. That's more or less what happened in the Australian gold rushes, the 1950s in Victoria and New South Wales, Queensland in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and Western Australia in the 90s. A huge rush of people. On average, they didn't earn supernormal incomes. The rent was dissipated in over-investment. Government regulation avoids that dissipation of rent. And copyright and patents create rents, but there's a public interest rationale for that, it provides an incentive for a public interest incentive for innovation. But there's also a public interest in free dissemination of knowledge, and good copyright law, good patents law finds a balance between exclusive rights of ownership and use, which generates rent, and limitations on periods before dissemination of knowledge becomes necessary. Another area where rents are necessary for economic efficiency is where you have overwhelming economies of scale. And I've mentioned the transmission lines or the gas pipelines or the railways. Whether rents are efficient or not, good or bad, they can be taxed without reducing investment. So long as the tax system is well designed for capturing rents and doesn't capture normal returns or quasi-rents. The search for neutral, non-distorting taxation is a search for tax on rent. In Australia, we've had successful experience of in a limited sphere with the petroleum resource rent tax, an unsuccessful attempt to broaden the scope of rent taxation in mining with the resources tax announced in 2010 and aborted in a couple of steps after that. Today I want to mainly discuss another approach which has some things in common with these taxes, but which is a two-sided rent tax which compensates losses as well as taxing profits. The proposed rent tax that I think would be a very efficient part of a recovery program in Australia. It's been developed over the last few years by Craig Emerson, Reuben Finnegan, Stephen Anthony and myself. We've given papers on it at the Melbourne Institute, at CEDA in Melbourne and other fora. And the key features of it is that it allows immediate deductibility of all capital expenditures. There's no deductibility for interest or other financing expenses. No deductibility for imported services unless they're directly connected to provision of the service in Australia. Negative cash flows receive credit at the tax rate. Now, you could achieve this by allowing tax losses, once certified by the tax office, to be traded, or the tax office could simply pay out when the certification occurs with the tax return. There needs to be a separate arrangement for banks and financial firms, and we suggest that we keep the current corporate tax rate with the tax system with them, with immediate expensing of capital expenditure. There has to be a transitional arrangement. We suggest that firms elect the time of transfer to the new system within 10-year limits. Those with big programs of investment coming up would elect to go immediately onto the new system. firms which, especially small firms which are suffering losses because of the pandemic recession, would want to go quickly to the new system and get the cash payouts. Firms which are not investing much and are benefiting from large interest deductions would want to delay. We'd give them choice within that 10-year period. We think that this sort of this change from a corporate income tax to the cash flow tax would be very suitable for current circumstances. We've done very detailed calculations. Had some help from the Parliamentary Budget Office through parliamentary members. Stephen Anthony's done a lot of detailed work on it. I think the initial budget cost is likely to be about 50 billion a year, but it would provide a very large boost to investment. And within over a 10-year period, even if there was no investment response to the new incentive structure, the tax office would get its money back over the 10 years. So it's ideally suited to the time profile required, a big stimulus for the establishment of full employment and pulling back the surplus, the deficit after that. The other economic advantages are avoidance of the corrosion of the tax base through the international race to the bottom. Very strong incentive to investment, very strong investment incentives for risk-taking because you're compensated for losses in the same proportion as for profits. Beth Webster at Swinburne's done a lot of work on financial incentives for innovation and stresses the importance of this type of adjustment. The change would remove artificial incentives for debt over equity and so reduce enterprise and systemic risk. By removing the artificial incentive to expanding debt, it would reduce vulnerability to financial crisis. Has been a very big feature of the developed world economy over recent decades. And the shift in tax systems would remove an advantage of foreign over domestic firms because foreign or international firms, including Australian-owned firms that go international, operate from tax havens, have a very big competitive advantage over other firms who pay their fair share of tax. Very hard for an Australian tax-paying entity to compete in the same business with a company that's geared its affairs to pay zero tax. The essential competitive advantage that the company Glencore had in taking over Mount Isa Mines, which was in some years the most highly capitalised company in Australia, a great innovator, a great explorer, a great contributor to change and improvement in the Australian mining system, very good at mining, nowhere near as good at tax evasion and avoidance as Glencore, so it couldn't offer the same price to its value to its shareholders. And that's because of the advantage that foreign firms have in tax avoidance and evasion. The move in tax systems that we've got in mind removes that advantage. Rent tax is more equitable between established and new firms, between large and small firms, domestic and foreign firms. And small business receives full deductions for losses. Large established firms already do that because losses of new areas of business are deducted against established business. Questions arise about how this relates to the big recent debates about negative gearing and franking credits. The issue of negative gearing disappears because you don't have deduction of interest. Franking credits remain as they are, and I think there's good rationale for that. The second big six over the boundary is reform of personal taxation and social security, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to go through this very important question very quickly. I might have to say a little bit more about it next week because I'll be going through it too too quickly now. But there are large advantages for economic efficiency and equity in integrating the tax and social security systems, with the combination having a uniform and moderate effective marginal tax rate up to a reasonably high income. I prepared a paper for the Business Council of Australia in 1997 proposing such an arrangement. They were days when the Business Council thought that its members had an interest in a more efficient Australian economy. I explained to the Business Council members then that the guarantee of a basic income and low effective marginal tax rates would create an environment in which workers would be more favourably inclined to cooperate with management in increasing flexibility and productivity. The problem then was that the introduction of the new tax and social security system would be costly to the budget bottom line, unless the initial marginal tax rates were set at fairly high levels, and if it was completely unconstrained as a general negative income tax, the initial tax rate would have had to have been 57%. It would come down to 47% with various constraints that I suggested in the paper. The marginal effective tax rate could have been brought down over a number of years to lower levels as income growth freed budgetary resources. The high starting rate for budget neutrality was the barrier. The current opportunity comes from the budgetary circumstances of the pandemic recession. The change now does not need to be neutral in the early years in its effect on budget revenues. The introduction of the reform with an initial high cost of the budget can form part of a post-pandemic full employment and growth strategy. The large transfers through the job seeker and JobKeeper and other temporary measures introduced in March and April will have to be extended or replaced if demand is not to fall over a cliff in September. And this is one of the ways in which demand falling over a cliff could be avoided. Does the proposal contribute more than alternative self-correcting stimulatory measures? It's worth a close look. I think it does. But I've not done yet the detailed work to speak with confidence. I did the work 23 years ago, but haven't done the detailed work now. The next step would be for the Australian Treasury to commission the Melbourne Institute using the HILDA data to do detailed studies of the budgetary, income distribution and labour force participation effects. Here I will set out the shape of the system that I think is worth testing. My preliminary calculations suggest that its cost to the budget will be substantial, but much less than continuing the March and April temporary measures. The budgetary cost would fall rapidly with progress towards full employment. The cost of the basic credits would rise roughly with population and revenues would rise with incomes. With greater labour force participation and dividends for more comprehensive productivity-raising reform, the net budgetary costs would continue to fall after full employment in 2023, perhaps to zero at the end of the decade. The measures may not be ready for implementation when JobSeeker and JobKeeper are due to be withdrawn in September, so it would be necessary to continue with temporary measures for a while. Detailed work by specialists would fine-tune levels of payments. So briefly, the structure of the system that I'm proposing, that first there'd be an unconditional payment at the New Start rate fortnightly. It's roughly 15,000 with a couple of the built-in add-ons, energy supplement and so on, into the accounts of all resident adult Australians. Premiums in line with current arrangements for old age and disability. So it'd be a higher basic payment for people above a certain age and with disabilities. The payments for child dependents will be brought within this system and simply added to the basic payments. This system would handle the income support for adult students. Based on current schedules, every dollar of Australians' personal income will be taxed at 37%. These are rough numbers I've done to come up with a degree of stimulus that I think will be appropriate to the current circumstances, and 45% above that. And if you compare that with current tax schedules, anyone earning more than 90,000 will be paying the same marginal tax rate as now. If a larger stimulus was required for or favoured, so that we would move with high certainty towards early full employment. We might even want to bring forward the 2022 tax schedules, where every dollar will be taxed at 30% up to $200,000 and 45% above that. That would actually be a very expensive step, but it's worth thinking about whether that's warranted on grounds of moving quickly to full employment. There are a number of restrictions that can be introduced to reduce costs. The total effect of the system, if I can go on now to the next slide, will provide high levels of income security for all Australians. The system would introduce a high degree of ease and integrity of administration. Administration is the next slide. The administration is very straightforward. Amongst other things, employers don't have to worry about correcting the right rate of PAYE withdrawal. It's the same rate for everyone, up to very high incomes, no work tests, and an automatic simple payment system. This new system, by providing lower effective marginal tax rates and the combination of the income tax system and Social Security, sometimes overlapping Social Security arrangements with different rates of withdrawal, will be to very substantially increase incentives to higher labour force participation, especially for people on lower incomes, working part-time, wanting to work more, and especially as second earners in household. As with the rent tax, if we go on to the next slide, as with the rent tax, the time profile will be highly favourable for recovery from the pandemic recession. A big initial cost gradually clawed back. Not clawed back to the extent and at the rate of the rent tax. Rent tax is rather uniquely favourably placed to contribute to big early stimulus and then withdrawal of contribution to the budget deficit, but the general shape of this reform is in the right direction. Going on quickly to the next chart, the reform will be favourable for national income growth, partly through incentives for labour force participation, but especially for the congenial environment that it provides for acceptance of wage restraint to increase employment, and for acceptance of structural change. So the reforms that are suggested in this lecture together would contribute a high proportion of the stimulus required in 2021 and 21-22 to put the economy on a path to full employment. With continued growth for a few years after achievement of full employment, the negative effect on budget revenue would have been withdrawn. The measures are therefore well suited to the macroeconomic environment. The integration of tax and Social Security in particular would contribute to a favourable environment for wage restraint in the approach to full employment and structural flexibility to raise productivity and incomes in the subsequent years. The large costs to the budget in the early years are not money that disappears into thin air, it's a transfer to people, and disproportionately on the corporate side, there's to companies that are doing high levels of investing, contributing to getting the economy going again, or experiencing current losses, and that includes the very large numbers of small business in that situation. In the case of the tax and Social Security integration, the transfers are especially to people on low incomes, getting some income from Social Security, beginning to some participation in the labour force and wanting to participate more. Many of them are the very people who've been hurt most by the pandemic recession. So both of these are reforms with large beneficial long-term effects. Both could only be introduced at a time when a large negative short-term budget deficit was acceptable and warranted. The pandemic recession provides an unusual opportunity for reforms with long-term benefits. We've had no such opportunity for nearly 30 years. We hope to have no such opportunity for a long time into the future. So let's take the chance while we can. Thanks, Abigail.
Thank you, Ross. So it's unfortunate that you were rushed through the second part of your lecture. So I will be looking forward to your expanding on it a little bit more next week. However, now is the time for a few questions. I have a range of questions. So let's start first on what you were talking about in most recently. So could you elaborate more on how the suggested universal minimum payment would increase participation rates in employment?
Yeah, and Abigail, maybe, I am answering after each lecture quite a number of questions online, so I'm happy to do the same again. Maybe next time, after I've answered questions online, if there are any other questions, maybe next time we could start with a couple of minutes on questions to take things further. But
Okay.
The overlapping of the income tax system and the separate social security system with its many parts, sometimes with a number of benefits, each having rates of withdrawal of the benefit as people earn income, it adds up to quite a high tax on the extra income earned when you put all of those things together. So that, for example, a woman with a couple of kids drawing on a couple of categories of social security, starting to work beyond the few hours that are allowed in most of these systems, will be paying some income tax, will be losing a proportion of each of the benefits, and it varies a lot depending on individual circumstances, but in many cases it adds up to a very high financial disincentive to labour force participation. And if you can get the overall marginal effective tax rate down, and I suggest 37%, but if we really want to have a big, quick push to full employment, and a lot of work has to be done to see whether that could be supported, maybe an even lower rate. But that would substantially reduce the marginal effective tax rate, the disincentive for employment for quite a lot of people, especially second earners, but others who take some money from Social Security now and have some participation in the labour force and would like more.
Okay, great, thank you. Do you have an opinion about whether or not the government should freeze the minimum wage?
One thing for sure is that a combination of high levels of expenditure and a high degree of wage restraint will give us stronger employment growth. If we want to return quickly to, not return because we didn't have full employment before, as I explained in earlier lectures, if we want to achieve full employment quickly, then we'd have a high degree of wage restraint. My suggestion is that if we've got this guarantee of income security in place, that it's going to be easier to ask the members of our democratic polity to accept that sort of constraint. A freeze on minimum wages is one way it could be done. The detailed arrangements can be worked out in a lot of ways, but the general point is we'll get quicker we'll get quicker to full employment with high levels of expenditure and high levels of wage restraint.
Okay, great. One more question on around equity, and then we're going to move to the rent tax. Do you see a role for public investment in social housing as a way of achieving housing equity and construction industry growth?
Yes, I think that there is a role for public investment in public housing. In our country, we have for a very long time, for 100 years, had a place for social housing, public investment in housing, and the problems arise with it from time to time, but on the whole, it's been a productive place. The zeitgeist has been a bit against public housing in recent times, but now is a good time to reconsider that and to have an element of public housing in the overall recovery program.
Okay, great. Now let's turn a little bit to the rent tax. So one question is, this person is focusing on the rent that might be associated with innovation. And so the question is, if you start taxing rent, will that reduce businesses' likelihood of taking risk or discourage them from trying to innovate?
Well, what my colleagues and I are suggesting is a two-sided tax where you make a payment to compensate negative cash flows each year at the same rate as you tax positive cash flows, and this actually has the effect of reducing risk, of narrowing the probability distribution of outcomes, chopping off a bit the high and low tails, but because it does not affect the mean, no investment proposition in research and development or anywhere else will fail at a test of expected net present value after the tax if it didn't fail it before the tax. So it actually is very strongly supportive of risky investments in research and development. One of the criticisms at the Melbourne Economic Forum that we had on the rent tax a couple of years ago was that it would lead to artificially high investment in research and development in Australia, and our initial response to that criticism was that we didn't see excessive investment in research and development as being an Australian problem. We could do with a lot more of it, but there's nothing in the structure of the tax that discourages risky investments. In fact, by compressing the probability distribution of outcomes, it encourages investment, and that's the reference I made to the work of Beth Webster on innovation.
Right. Okay, let's finish with one last question. So, could your suggested policies provide regional Australia with a competitive advantage?
I don't think these two policies, these two sixes over the fence in themselves would do that. But next week I'll be discussing the opportunities for Australia in the emerging zero emissions world economy and how making use of those can play a major part in recovery. And these benefits are disproportionately focused in rural and provincial Australia. So just making good use of the opportunities that are there and that are enhanced by the proposals on corporate tax in particular would benefit these new industries which are naturally located in rural and provincial Australia. There's a few links in the chain of argument, but I think you would get greater investment and growth in rural and provincial Australia as a result of these changes.
Excellent. Okay, so Ross, thank you very much, but unfortunately we are running out of time. To those of you who have raised questions, we are going to endeavor to answer some of your questions in our follow-up email. We've now had 4 informative and engaging lectures, and I hope you're going to join us again next week on June 17th, where Ross is going to be talking about building the superpower of the low-carbon world economy. Now, as director of the Melbourne Institute, I would like to thank you for suggesting that the Treasury commission us to use HILDA data to test your ideas for supporting individuals. Also, as director of the Melbourne Institute, I would like to mention that we are initiating a new virtual colloquium series starting on Tuesday, June 16th. That's going to focus on a range of economic and social issues in Australia. We will kick off the series with a discussion of opioid overdoses and the effects of the current economic conditions on the crisis. The link for learning more and registering will be posted in the chat function shortly. Alternatively, you can go to melbourneinstitute.com to learn more. So again, please let me thank Ross again for a great lecture, and I look forward to seeing you next week.